Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. After taking you to all sorts of exotic places lately, I thought I'd come back to the farm and actually do a video here for you. And it's on a topic that, you know, occasionally this time of year especially occupies my mind, and that is the subject of time management on a macadamia farm. And I know from my almost 1,000 subscribers now that some of you are curious about having a macadamia farm as a lifestyle option. Some of you are full-time macadamia farmers. Some of you juggle 2 jobs, including macadamia farming and a sideline, a secondary sideline, but you're still mainly macadamia farmers. And there's probably multiple combinations in between those 2 extremes. And of course there's the pit street farmers who don't do anything on their macadamia farm and they outsource everything. And I can say now, look, I'm almost 5 years in and I'm loving it, and I don't plan to stop it as far as I know. We've got a lovely healthy macadamia A4 here with a bunch of nuts that'll be ready to fall soon. But in between the rows here, you can see a hell of a lot of grass. And that was mowed 4 weeks ago, as is the aisle next to it. As I go across the farm though, we'll come across some areas that I mowed only 2 weeks ago. And while it looks different, when you're in February and you're getting some rain, the grass grows very, very quickly, and you need to keep it down, either with a slasher or with a mower. Now in this particular case it's going to take a slasher because the grass has grown to the point where it would strain a mower too much. I'm also suffering some misfortune with my own mower, which has developed problems with one of its wheel motors, and that can be, I'm told, a very expensive fix. So I'm crossing fingers and waiting on that. But look, at least my slasher's still going. And one tip for anyone considering a macadamia farm is that you need at least 2 machines that cut grass, because when one goes down, you don't want to be left completely stranded, because if the grass gets completely out of control when the nuts start falling, you essentially lose your crop. And so keeping it under control is a big deal. And yeah, it does make me feel a little bit behind driving around the area as I've been doing on this trip, and seeing lots of nice groomed macadamia rows ready to enter the harvest season when the nuts start falling on the old varieties in March. So yeah, right now I'm feeling behind, and I suppose you can take that video in this sort of context. Now, here's the pitfall. When you look at buying a macadamia farm and thinking, well, I can come up and do some work part-time on the macadamia farm, and I can spend part of my time, say, in Sydney, or, you know, again, even if you live up here and you're spending part of the time on your job and the other part of your time on a macadamia farm. One thing that's easy to forget is that there's plenty of times when macadamia farm work is pretty much impossible. We've had very heavy rain here up at Rosebank, and when you get that heavy rain, even when the sun comes out like you see now, it's not something where you can get straight on a machine and start slashing or mowing. Now, particularly on a 0-turn mower, you'll go for a slide, but on tractors as well, where the ground is really soft and wet, you can find that on a hill the wheels start turning and your tractor's no longer going forward, and you think, uh-oh, we've got a problem here. Tractors don't get bogged nearly as easily as 0-turn mowers do, but they can still get in a situation where they're not going to do you any good, and it's hard to get, you know, work done. So, you know, it's not just a matter of saying, well, look, Wednesday to Friday I'll do macadamia farming, and Monday to Tuesday I'll do something else. It doesn't work like that. The demands of a macadamia farm really vary a lot with the weather. And once you get to accept that, you need to say, well, look, you know, sometimes when I'm up at the farm, I'm not going to be productive. I'm going to have that sort of period where even if it's not raining. I've got to wait for the grass to dry out. So we've had a couple of hours sun already here, and you can see there's still beads of water on the grass everywhere. And it doesn't have to be completely dry before you mow or slash it, but look, it does help. The other thing about budgeting time for a macadamia farm is that you can't just do some time equation and say, you know, it's going to take X hours of my time per week. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first and most obvious is the seasons. Okay, so this was mowed 2 weeks ago in February. It's now up to the point where probably a mower could handle it, but I'm going to come along on my slasher anyway for the reason that my mower's temporarily out of action. That's fine, and it will take a certain amount of time. In winter, I could leave it 2 weeks and you wouldn't see any lawn growth. Or you might see a few weeds come up, but you wouldn't see anything that actually needs mowing. So the biggest job that you do on a farm, which is in fact mowing and keeping your grounds under control, is very busy. It starts getting busy in November when the rains start up, and it doesn't really let go of you until at least midway through the harvest season. So, we get some fairly high rainfall almost all the way up until June, and then July, it really sort of lets you go. So if you're trying to compute how much time a macadamia farm's going to take, it varies on that time of year. The other big jobs that you do occasionally on the farm, so we're talking fertilizing, spraying, pruning, those sorts of things, you either do them yourself, or perhaps you're going to outsource them to someone else, and it's then a matter for them getting to your place and doing things when you want them to. And again, contractors aren't magic. They're affected by the rain and everything else. So if there's a patch of rain that holds up a job that you wanted done this week, might have to be done next week or the week after that. And you do need a bit of patience and some lead time with contractors, because they suffer the same problems as a stationary farmer would. And the same goes for contract harvesting. The nuts are on the ground, you want them picked up, you're impatient to get those crops in while they're nice and fresh. But that's the time of year when everyone's doing that, and it's not like you can be terribly different from your neighbour who might be running a macadamia farm with the same contractor and also competing for his or her time. What does that mean in terms of people who are considering buying a macadamia farm and who haven't actually had that experience yet? Well, whatever time you think it takes to run a macadamia farm, it's sometimes worth doubling that just for the sake of calculation, because perhaps in this time of year, given that there's rain quite often, sometimes half your time can be downtime. And there's always things to do on a farm. You can go and prune off low branches. You can look after baby macadamias that you plant. There are other sort of ancillary jobs on a farm. You can even sort of work on your machinery a little bit, to the extent that any machinery. You can clean things out, make sure things are serviced, and that sort of task. But actual field work is something where, you can make a plan, but the weather can interfere with those plans, and you need to accept mentally that there's some element of frustration that you're going to have to put up with. It won't drive you crazy unless you let it. And I think the longer you do it, the more accepting you become of, the fact that the rains will fall, that you actually need them for your crop anyway, so they're not a bad thing. They're just something that gets in the way of your plans sometimes. What does that mean in terms of the kind of farm you might want to buy if you can't farm full time? And that's an important question. I looked at Nutkin Farm back in 2019 amongst a bunch of other farms, some of which were bigger, a couple of which were smaller than Nutkin Farm. And by smaller, I mean in terms of planted hectares. So Nutkin, I have about 13 planted hectares. I'd be up here around about a third of the time and doing my other jobs away from the farm or sometimes in the local area the rest of the time. Now, 13 planted hectares isn't huge for a macadamia farm. It's definitely bigger than a hobby farm. It's not as big as a serious commercial farm. You know, serious commercial farms we're sort of looking at least 20 hectares, perhaps 25 hectares and above of planted trees. And in hindsight, I suppose I can give you an honest perspective, and that is sometimes I fall behind with that level of planted hectares, particularly in things like the grass management. And you can play catch up, you can pay contractors if you're wealthy enough to do that and get them to get the ground ready for you for harvest, and those are really good things to do, and the contractors definitely are quicker than an amateur farmer at doing those things, and in general they have better equipment in general. But you need to factor that into the equation. Certainly when I went to one real estate agent in the process of hunting for a farm, she asked me very sensitively, very gingerly, look, is it a hobby farm size you're sort of talking about, or would it need to be a little bit bigger than that? And my answer was, it needs to be a little bit bigger than that. I don't regret the answer that I gave, but I'm in a position where personally I'm an empty nester. My kids have grown up and left home. There's nobody else that depends on me, and so my movements are very much something I fit in between work commitments. So I'm in that position where, to an extent, I can deal with a bigger workload than perhaps someone who has other mouths to feed and who has other commitments in terms of school, young children, that sort of thing. For persons who have that sort of extra commitment, or even looking after an elderly relative, that sort of thing. For people who have those sorts of burdens on their time and they want to do macadamia farming as a part-time pursuit, I'd be saying to you, look for a smaller farm. Look for something a bit easier to manage. And, it's not just a function of planted hectares. When things rain, the farms on slopes like this do take longer to get back into a, workable condition. The drainage is better, which is great. However, the chances of going for a slide on a wet slope are also greater. And, that's an occupational health and safety issue, and we all need to take account of those. So I suppose, the message to people who are looking at macadamia farming is that I don't want you to approach it entirely as a mathematical exercise. The time you think it'll take to run the farm will almost certainly not be the time that it actually takes to run a farm. I'd also say to you that if the farm is of a size where you can keep things under control yourself, you save contractor costs, you save labour costs, and where, for example, you're mowing a block like this, right? This is going to take slashing. The slashing will get the grass down, and then you can mow between the trees after that. And slashing always takes longer than mowing in general. But once you do get the grass down, if you can keep it down with a mower, then because a mower runs along the ground much faster than a tractor will, the mowing then always becomes more time efficient and better in the sense of you're not, cutting over very long grass clippings. So, I've taken on block one here anything between half a day to do the lot when it's a nicely groomed slope. That's sort of more like what it takes me in winter. And at its very worst, I think February 21 was probably the worst I let it get. At its very worst, it took me 2 days to get this whole block down to an acceptable level. So yeah, there's an efficiency thing as well, not just a straight time equation. If you can keep things under control, it's quicker to maintain them there rather than a process of it gets out of control, you bring it back under control, it gets out of control again. And, certainly in terms of satisfaction and, you have a job well done, if you're a bit of a perfectionist, like I like to be, it's better to try and keep something properly under control than do a half-hearted job over a farm that was sort of too big for you to get in the first place. And look, I've had this discussion with a few people lately, so I'm helping a couple of subscribers now who are looking at they're in their final stages of buying a reasonably large macadamia farm. And I've also had the same discussion with Bruce Chester, who's at the end of his macadamia farming career at age 70, and who through his 60s was able to manage a small macadamia farm pretty much single-handedly and eke a small profit out of it simply because of that. But as he got older in particular, it was a real question of for how long can you go on maintaining a farm. Obviously, if it's a smaller farm with a smaller number of trees, you've got that extra capacity to go on longer than if you had a very large operation where you either have to make difficult calls about outsourcing to contractors and foregoing a lot of your profit, or actually giving up altogether. I've asked myself the brutal question as well. Look, if you were starting the process today, would I have bought Nutkin Farm? The answer is yes, but a much more qualified yes. It would have been something where I would have budgeted much more time to actually run the farm properly than I thought it would take. And again, I fell into the very trap I'm warning you against. I fell into the trap of saying, look, it's only going to be X days a week or X days a month. And I assumed that I'd be able to do farm work on all of those days. Don't fall into my trap. Learn from my lesson. Macadamia farming is an absolutely wonderful, joyful thing. But it's much more joyful if you go into it with realistic expectations of what you can do and the time it takes to do it in. I'll leave you with this beautiful sight over the farm looking towards the Nightcap Ranges, and hope to talk to you again soon. Bye for now.